what New York Giant players need to step up in 2025, and what are we going to be looking for in terms of their improvement? I'll tell you about that and more coming up next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI, which is where you can find all my written work. And as always, we welcome on in our Blue Crew community members, our everydayers, our newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day. And on today's show, we're going to take a look at three areas. We're going to kick things off with who needs to step up for the Giants the most in 2025. I have a short list, but it's an important list. So I'll tell you who they are, why they need to step up, and what areas they need to especially step up in. All right. Then in segment 2, we're going to take a look at two X factors, one on the offensive side of the ball, one on the defensive side of the ball. These X factors that I've identified, their performances in 2025 are going to be critical for the team. So that we'll take a look at that in 2. And then in segment 3, we're going to take a look at what we've learned from the first week of OTAs. Now, there's been some things that have come out that we need to keep tracking as we go through the rest of the OTAs, the summer, and so on and so forth. So I'll identify what some of these things are and why they are so significant and how the Giants can build on them in OTAs, which resume this week. They resume on Monday. So that is our schedule of topics for today. Again, welcome on in. All right, let's get things started. We're going to take a look at who needs to step up in 2025 and what do they need to show to kind of convince everybody that they're on the upswing. Now, you can make an argument that everybody returning from last year's 3-14 team, everybody needs to step up. And that would be a fair statement to be made. But there are certain players that I think especially need to step up. And if you watch the film, if you watch them in practice, watch them in the games, there are certain things that you kind of take note of that when you go and you do the research into the stats, you say to yourself, oh, wow, this guy was really lacking in this particular area, and he really shouldn't be as far as, what his position calls for. So let's go down the list. I've got 4 for you. We're going to start off with an obvious one, a guy that I practiced last week based on the OTA practice that the media was allowed to see, and that is receiver Jaylen Hyatt. Now, Jaylen Hyatt, the big thing about him that I think has been holding him back has been, actually, there's 2 things I'm going to cite. The first thing is his blocking and his ability to shake coverage. Just the whole physical aspect of his game is not really what you want to see it at. And I don't know if that's a result of his frame just being so thin that he's not able to bulk up even further without jeopardizing his speed, or what the case may be. Maybe it's a desire of, or a lack of desire to do it. I don't know the answer to that. But blocking and shaking coverage, 2 very critical things that Jaylen Hyatt has not really shown to date in his career. Now, we couldn't really tell in the OTAs because there's no contact, obviously, but that's something he's going to need to show once the summer gets here and the pads go on. The second thing with Jaylen Hyatt, and this was kind of important, I think, and this is something we can kind of keep an eye on as we go through the spring, that is his ability to track the deep ball. Now, according to Pro Football Focus, last year, Jaylen Hyatt was targeted 8 times on passes of 20 or more yards. How many receptions did he have? 0. Goose egg. All right. That's not good. When you want a guy who's going to stretch the field, you want him to be able to better track the ball. And Jaylen Hyatt did not do a good job of that, particularly with the deep ball. So, and interestingly, in those deep passes that he was targeted on, 2 of them were contested catches, and he was 0-2 uncontested catches. So Jaylen Hyatt, if he could show a little bit more physicality in his game, do a better job of tracking the deep ball and coming down with the deep ball, you will have known that he has finally taken the step forward, and maybe he'll see more time on the field. So that's kind of what's been holding him back if you kind of look at the game film on him. All right, obviously, number 2, this is another obvious guy, Deontay Banks, cornerback. Now, Deontay Banks, I mentioned on past shows that last year when he was asked to play zone coverage, he looked lost and he got frustrated as a result of really not knowing what to do. That was sort of the truth, but you go back and you look at the number of snaps he played in zone the year prior, it wasn't that far off from what he was asked to do last year. So 2 things are going to, I think, affect how Deontay Banks does this year. Number 1, he's not going to be assigned the opponent's WR1. That's going to be a big help. That job will probably go to Paulson Adebo. So that right there should help, because Deontay Banks, when he came into the league, remember, he wasn't on the wide receiver 1 for the opponent in his rookie season, as often as he was last year. And he did well. So you just have to have baby steps with him and get him up to speed there. Now, some areas of his game where he does need to definitely show improvement and where he can step up include taking better angles within zone. Okay, zone could be very tricky because if you play too far deep in your zone or not, close enough, you're going to get burned. You're going to end up taking poor angles. You're going to end up grabbing and holding a guy. And that was a problem you saw with Deontay Banks, particularly, again, against wide receiver 1s. Now, what was interesting about Banks, besides the fact that he saw his completion percentage rise from 57.6 as a rookie to 67.1 last year, what was interesting, penalties, right? The Giants last year, actually 2 years, for 2 years, the Giants have had 15 defensive pass interference penalties called against them. For Banks, he has accounted for 7 of those 15. All right, 4 in 2024, 3 the year prior. So that kind of aligns with what I'm saying as far as, better tracking the ball carrier, and not being grabby. That learning zone a little bit better maybe can help him with some of that stuff, because, when he loses the battle, he tends to be grabby. And when you're grabby as a defensive back, you're going to get a yellow flag thrown at you just about every time if you get caught. So that's something you definitely want to see Deontay Banks improve on. And he will. I think he will. I think he'll be better at it. Okay. Kavon Tibido, outside linebacker. Now, yes, Kavon Tibido missed time last year with the wrist injury. So that had a direct effect on his numbers. But the thing that Thibodeau, I think, needs to really show more of, and we haven't really seen it as often in his game so far, he's been playing more of a reaction type of a game as opposed to an attack style. So I'd like to see him maybe be a little bit more aggressive with his pass rush plan instead of kind of sitting back and letting things come to him. Go out, carpe diem, seize the day. I don't think he did enough of that last year. I think if he does that, he's going to finally reach the levels that I think the Giants were hoping to get out of him. Hasn't been bad. I want to stress that. He has not been an absolute disaster, but he could be a lot better than what he has been. And I think he knows it. The Giants certainly know it. And look, this is a big year coming up for him to see if he can reach those heights. All right, one more guy I want to talk about that is a guy that I think you're going to say, yes, he belongs on this list, is center John Michael Schmitz. All right, now with John Michael Schmitz, he has been steady. Hasn't been great. You look at him and you say, well, he hasn't quite lived up to his draft pedigree. So he has been steady. There's been gradual improvement. For example, 2 fewer pass pressures allowed last year than from his rookie season. And that is 2 fewer pass pressures in 646 pass protection snaps versus the 484 he had the year prior. So that's kind of a positive for him. Where John Michael Schmitz really needs to up his game is in the physicality aspect of it. He just, he just, when you look at him, especially when he gets to the second level, when was the last time you saw him consistently hit a guy? Instead, you see him kind of sealing a guy off. And with John Michael Schmitz, you want to see him hit more guys. All right. Sealing has its advantages and there's a place for it in the game, but for an offensive lineman, you want to see them putting guys on their fannies. And I don't think John Michael Schmitz has done enough of that. So you'd like to see a little bit more physicality, a little bit more of a mean streak in his game. You also, want to see him improve his footwork, especially when he has to slide into pass protection or mirror guys. That wasn't really, that great. So John Michael Schmitz, steady improvement. It's slow, but it's steady. You'd like to kind of see him take the next huge step in his development coming up in year 3. So that's for John Michael Schmitz. All right, now coming up next, we've got X factors. I've got one for you on offense, one for you on defense. I'll tell you who they are, why they're X factors, and I'll mention a couple of things within their respective games that is going to make a difference if they are able to replicate that from prior stops or prior years, I should say. Hey, Giant fans, as a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. That's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, and get qualified candidates all in one place. LinkedIn's new feature can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. Add the hiring hashtag frame to your profile picture, and you can potentially double your reach to qualified candidates. No wonder why 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. So go on, post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. Terms and conditions apply. All right, welcome back, Giant fans, to Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. Coming up this week, the Giants have OTA. I think it's number 6, and that's on Thursday. So the media will be in the building for OTA number 6. I'll be there. I'll have for you observations, takeaways, what the players had to say. I know a lot of you on the YouTube channel like the little clips that I post, the players' responses to my questions. So I'll continue to do that. If you like it, I'll continue to bring that to you. All right. Now, in this segment, talk about X factors. And there's 2 guys, one on each side of the ball, that I think we can say are X factors for this team's success. And I kind of gave you a little hint at the end of last segment, but let's get into it. First guy, obviously, is going to be quarterback Russell Wilson. All right. You're probably sitting there saying, well, no kidding. Russell Wilson, the quarterback, of course, he's going to be an X factor. But there's a couple of areas in particular where Russell Wilson can potentially help the Giants' passing game improve. And having looked up the stats, I was like really blown away by this, because these are things that Russell Wilson did well, not only last year, but throughout his career. Number 1 is protection calls, right? Now, we take it for granted that, when a quarterback gets sacked, it's always on the offensive line. And it looks that way probably 99.9% of the time. But sometimes it's the protection call. Now, I remember one time last year, I think it was a running back. I can't remember. I can't remember if it was Devin Singletary or Tyrone Tracy, but I remember there being a mismatch where a running back was asked to block a defensive end. That's all stuff, that the quarterback should be able to set, the protection calls. And there were a few breakdowns last year in the protection where you say, oh, so-and-so gave up the sack. Well, if the protection calls aren't set, that's a problem. This is something that Russell Wilson can hopefully, fix for the Giants moving forward. He's really good at setting protection calls. Where Russell Wilson gets into trouble sometimes is if he holds the ball too long. So these are things you're going to keep an eye on, certainly as we get into the mini camp and, of course, into training camp and the preseason. So something to keep an eye on there. All right, another thing for Russell Wilson, deep ball accuracy. We all know about Wilson and the moon ball, how that's his specialty. Let me give you some stats from Pro Football Focus. Big time throws, which are considered deep throws of 20 plus yards or throws made into tight windows. Russell Wilson had a 37.5% success rate with that, which was the best of all the Giants quarterbacks last year. So if he had been on the Giants last year, his success rate would have topped the Giants quarterbacks easily. And of those big time throws, only 1.8% were turnover worthy. So that's pretty good. That's would be the lowest amongst the Giants, if he had been on the Giants last year in the quarterback's room. So Russell Wilson, 54% completion rate, 17 yards per attempt on the big time throws, 27 first downs, a 122.1 NFL rating on pass attempts of 20 plus yards. That's been missing from the offense, folks. It's coming back with Russell Wilson for however long he's in the offense as a starter. One last thing I want to mention about Russell Wilson before I get to the defensive side of the ball, play action. Again, not something that was really there for the Giants last year. Russell Wilson had a 67.8% completion rate, 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions on play action passes. Play action, Giants need to get that rolling. It was missing on a consistent basis. Russell Wilson, the takeaway here is he can throw deep, he can throw with touch. So as a transition quarterback, as a bridge quarterback, I think the Giants got a pretty good option there. Now, how long Russell Wilson remains as a starter, that I don't know. But clearly, compared to what the Giants had last year in the quarterback room, Russell Wilson is an upgrade, and he's going to be an X factor in terms of that offense, adding potency to the offense, taking advantage of the receivers and their deep speed. All that's going to click, hopefully, fingers crossed, for the Giants. All right, on the defensive side of the ball, the X factor, safety Javon Holland. Now, Javon Holland, I said this last week on the show. I think a reason why Deontay Banks had some struggles is because last year, not only did he have to deal with wide receiver 1, but he didn't have Xavier McKinney in the lineup next to him. He had a rookie in Tyler Nubin played sometimes next to him. Sometimes it was Jason Pinnock who played next to him. And the way Jason Pinnock in particular was asked to execute the defense, let's just say he wasn't asked to do things that he did well. Jason Pinnock was good at blitzing. In coverage, he wasn't quite as good. So sometimes you look at the film and you say, the help, the deep safety help was late getting over there. So Deontay Banks, I don't want to say he was blameless, but having a good safety next to him, an experienced safety next to him, a difference maker next to him is going to help him in some of the defensive packages that we'll see them that he'll be in. All right, so getting back to Javon Holland here. Javon Holland finished 39th out of 171 safeties in run defense per Pro Football Focus. His pass rush, same, 39th out of 171. He has 30 career pressures, so Javon Holland can rush the passer, can drop into coverage. His 3 sacks in 2021 were a career high, as were his 16 pressures, a career high. Now, worth noting is that in 2021, he played in Brian Flores's defense. So the Flores obviously moved on. The Dolphins last year with a different defensive coordinator. So things change. Suddenly when you see a player drop off, it's not necessarily because he suddenly got bad or he forgot how to do something. It could be how he was deployed. So I'm curious to see how Shane Bowen is going to deploy Javon Holland. Is he going to mix in some of what Brian Flores did to get the most out of Javon Holland, or does he have a different plan? So all that will tell whether or not Javon Holland can live up to what the Giants are hoping he can be. All right, Giant fans, coming up next, OTAs. We're heading into week 2. What we learned and what the Giants are going to build on, hopefully, in the coming weeks. That's coming up right after this. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. And OTAs continue this week. The Giants are back on the field on Monday. As I mentioned earlier in the show, we're not in the building. The media is not in the building till Thursday. I'll be there. I'll have a report for you, the observations. But I want to touch base or kind of recap, if you will, some of the key things that the Giants are going to need to build on that I think are important, and they're kind of setting the stage for what's still to come. The first thing is the quarterback plan. Brian Daboll spoke about having a plan, didn't tell us what the plan was, but from what we could see right now, the reps are split evenly between Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston. And I think the reason for that, if we're going to kind of take a guess here, the reason for that is they're both probably about at the same point in learning this offense. I think once you start to see Wilson's snaps increase and Winston's snaps decrease, that'll be a positive thing. So I wouldn't quite say that there's a competition for the starting job, but I did find it interesting that, based on the stats that I kept, and granted they're unofficial, but based on the number of snaps that I kept for each guy, that they were equal. So that was kind of telling. And that's something to keep an eye on, like I said, moving forward. Is Russell Wilson going to get more snaps, as he should? Is Jameis Winston going to see some of his snaps decline? Is Jackson Dart going to see some of his snaps increase? So these are all things to keep an eye on with the quarterback position. Not a true competition, but kind of is in a way. All right. We talked about the defense. The thing I liked about the defense, and this could just be a matter of fact, something that we see anyway in the springtime, given that there's no pads, there's no contact allowed, but particularly in the back end of the defense, what I noticed and what I think I'd like to see the Giants continue to build on, they're playing faster. Looks like they're thinking a lot less. And that could be a result, again, of this being year 2 of the Shane Baldwin system. So you kind of like to see that, because when a guy sits there and he thinks about something, that little hesitation is just enough what a receiver needs to break free and do some damage. So you see it more so on the back end of the defense. The front end, again, the offensive lineman can't block the pass rush. So a lot of times you're going to see guys get through and you're going to say, oh, that should have been a sack. When in fact, you have to say to yourself, would that guy have been blocked had there been contact allowed? So you got to take the sack numbers and the pressures at this time of year into, take them with a grain of salt. But the back end of the defense, which was a problem last year for the Giants, much, much better in terms of coverage, at least so far based on what I've seen. They need to continue that, because the Giants were burned a little too often on deep plays. They were burned a little too often with missed tackles at the second level and beyond. These are all things that need to be cleaned up. I talked about angles earlier in the show when I was talking about Deontay Banks, something that needs to continue to improve, and I think they're headed in the right direction with that. All right, Giant fans, that's going to do it for this edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. Of course, we'll have the OTA report. That will be done on Thursday. I'll get that out to you as soon as I can, as we continue to bring you coverage here on the Locked On Giants podcast. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Giants podcast your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On NFL Scouting. As training camps get closer and moves are being made, hosts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino will make you the most informed NFL fan this offseason. Find Locked On NFL Scouting on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Giant fans, I'll see you again. Have a good one, everybody.